In the next few minutes, I want to tell you about the most helpful tool I've learned when talking about race. So, let's talk about it. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another video on this channel. My name is Chase, and this channel is not centered around talks about race and discussions about race relations, but over the last couple weeks, I've received several questions and comments regarding race and talking about race, and people saying, how can I talk about it? And if you've been on this channel for a while, you know that I'm huge on starting that conversation and thinking that the only way that we're ultimately going to see change in our society is if we start by talking about things that make us uncomfortable. I don't think that change ultimately comes top down from some sort of policy or financial organization that we can donate to. All that's great, but I think if we really want to see true change in our country and in our own lives, we need to start with that conversation at the bottom and work our way up. So with that being said, I wanted to make this hopefully short video just to tell you about what probably is the most helpful thing that I've learned in the last couple years about talking about race. And it comes from this book that I read called Right Color, Wrong Culture. It's by Brian Loritz. If you are a leader in church ministry, or if you're involved in the church at all, it is the most helpful book on race from a church perspective that I've read. So people ask me a lot, what resources should I read? Right Color, Wrong Culture. Get it now. I'll put a link in the description. And the subtitle on the book is it's even a leadership fable because it's told in a fable, a storytelling kind of way. But one of the most helpful parts of the book, I won't tell you the whole book because you got to get it. It's worth it. And I'd love to talk to you about it if you do read it. But one of the most helpful parts of the book is this illustration that he gives where he basically says and makes the argument that every culture is broken down into three subcultures. He calls these C1, C2, and C3. So if you're watching this right now, then you're either a C1, a C2, a C3, or somewhere in between on that spectrum. And so here's what that is. So he says a C1 is someone who's of a certain ethnicity or culture that completely identifies with a different ethnicity or culture. That's completely merged into a different ethnicity or culture. So for example, two examples that I'd give, one that he gives in the book, someone who's black, who identifies more with white culture. So the example he gives is Carlton from Fresh Prince. Or I'd say if someone who's white, but identifies more with black culture, so someone like Eminem, right? Something tells me Eminem's probably more comfortable at the barbecue than he is in suburban white America. All right, so that's a C1, someone who identifies or relates more outside of their own ethnicity. A C3 is someone who only really is comfortable with people who are like them. And he calls this culturally inflexible. And there's tons of examples. The example he gives in the book would be Al Sharpton. Even I'd say people who are first-generation immigrants and don't speak English, they clearly relate more with people who are like them and speak like them. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to be with people who are like you, and I'll get to that in a second. If we want to use the white or black illustration, it would be someone who's white who can't relate outside of their own race, right? Maybe they've only grown up in the small town and only interacted with white people. Side note, I mean, some of you might find this crazy, some of you might not. When I was in college, I had several people who are white tell me, hey, you're the first black person that I've actually had a real conversation with. Might sound crazy, especially if you live in or near a city, but there's pockets all over the United States where people who are white are able to only see white people unless they go on vacation, and you're not having real conversations with people then. And same with people who are black. People who are black, there's some people who are only comfortable with people who are black, and they're not comfortable at all with people outside of their own race. So you have C1s, people who relate more with people outside of their own ethnicity, and then you have C3s, people who only relate within their own ethnicity, and then you have C2s, right? And C2s are people who seem to be able to kind of go back and forth between crossing cultural lines. And he calls this culturally flexible and adaptable without being ethnically ambiguous or hostile. That's the phrase that he uses in the book. And ultimately, he goes on to make the argument that all of us should be striving to be C2s, and that particularly in leadership, he's talking about at the church leadership level, but if you want one organization to be multi-ethnic, then you have to have people who are C2s at the highest level. So why is this interesting? Why is this helpful when we're talking about race with other people? Well, because I think some of the biggest problems and altercations when people of different races are talking to each other is when you have two C3s that don't realize they're C3s and they're yelling back and forth at each other. and you have some white people who are unfamiliar with the black experience, and some who even refuse to acknowledge that that's such a thing, that are trying to force their opinions on people who are black. And then you have people who are black who don't understand why the white C3s over here aren't listening, and then you just have people screaming back and forth at each other. And also, I think another huge problem, and we see this all the time, is when someone who's a C3 finds someone who's a C1 and kind of uses that C1 to validate their own beliefs, not realizing that that person who's in the C1 camp is more culturally like the C3. So, and I won't mention any names. This goes back to what I talked about in the last video about the whole my black friend said. There's some people who are white, and this goes both ways, who will find a black C1 and hold them up and say, look, my beliefs are true about what black people believe and need to believe because look at what this person said, but they don't realize that that person's actually a C1. So I know it can get confusing with the numbers and the letters and all that stuff, but ultimately our goal should all be to be C2s if we want to move forward at all. I'm not saying your best friends need to look like a stock photo, but we should all be working to become C2s and to be comfortable crossing cultural lines and having these conversations, right? This chart is not like the Enneagram where you can just say, hey, sorry, I'm a C3, that's just who I am, you got to get used to it. No, we should all be working to become C2s. And I think this is extremely helpful because as we're having these conversations about race, we can recognize who we're talking to, right? We don't tell people, hey, I think you're a C1. Don't tell anybody that, especially if they're black. Or you don't say, hey, I think you're a C3, that's why you don't get it. You don't actually tell people that, but you realize that as you're having those conversations, and hopefully that will cause us to have more patience when we're talking to someone, because we realize that as we're engaging in these conversations, the person might not just be hostile and angry, or they're not an evil, mean person. They just don't know. They've been in their little C3 bubble with other C3s and getting their belief validated by other C3s, and so they might not get it. And for those of you watching this who might not be in contexts where you can have a lot of conversations with people who don't look like you, well, if you start to drift over into that C2 category, and even if you're still surrounded by C3s, you can have those conversations with other C3s and start to bring them over to that C2 category, where then maybe we can all have this conversation together. So thanks for watching this video. Again, this book that I read, I'm gonna put a link to it in the description below. If you are in church leadership especially, this is a must read. Even if you're involved in different ministries or even just other different forms of leadership and you want your business or whatever it is to be multi-ethnic, then you have to read this book. If you enjoyed these last few videos I've been making about race, or maybe some of the other videos on this channel, I'd love it if you hit the subscribe button. We've actually gotten almost 100 new subscribers in just the last month, which is incredible. And so I'm so thankful for all of you who have been watching these videos. But as always, I will see you guys on another video. Thanks for watching.